Hello everyone, welcome to Data Platform Summit 2020. This is Power Apps and AI, a flow of location events. Let's go ahead and get started. A little bit about myself. My name is Jeremy Frye. I'm one of the professional services senior managers at Navisite for data analytics. I've been with the company for over 10 years, and I've been within SQL Server and data analytics from an experience standpoint for over 12 years. And I've been an active speaker and participant in the SQL community for several years. And one of the things about myself is I like enjoying spending time with my family and being outdoors. The agenda for today will be covering an end-to-end functional solution of Power Apps. We'll also be talking about the actual design and functionality, so we'll do a deeper dive into how the Power App demo that we're going to be showing is built. We'll also be talking about how we incorporate Power Apps for process automation to automate several different processes from within a Power Apps. And then we'll also be extending the end user's experience by looking at cognitive services and how to apply AI models to that. So when we talk about applications are everywhere. Talk about desktop applications and applications you use every day on your computer. You also go now into popular mobile devices such as tablets and phones where you have applications. Regardless of the device or application, you always have some sort of user experience that you have to interface, with data. That's where Power Apps comes in. So what is Power Apps? Power Apps is an application development solution. It's built for mobile devices as well as web browsers. And one of the things that I really love about Power Apps is the versatility of it being able to connect to so many different services and data points. This is just a very brief slide that shows an overview of the license cost of Power Apps. Power Apps comes in two license costs. One is for a single app and the other is for unlimited apps. Both are user-based, so really when it comes down to what kind of license is better for your organization, you really need to look at the number of active apps you want to run and also the number of users that will be actually utilizing or running Power Apps. This is just a bit more of a breakdown of the license, and really it's to highlight some of the differences between the two so you can also look at features when you're making a decision on licensing as well. Really the two things to look at here are how many apps you can have active at a time in a per app plan versus the per user plan. And then additionally, you want to look at it at a common data service standpoint. So really there's a big size difference when it comes to how large your common data service can be. Before we jump right into one of our end-to-end demos here, we really wanted to talk about a specific use case. I always think that when I show a demo, to use it in a real world scenario makes a lot more sense, and it comes across a lot easier to understand how you would use it in this type of a situation. And since Power Apps or applications in general are end user based, we really want to show how you could use this in a real type of situation. So what we're looking at is transportation management. So you have companies such as Uber, Lyft, UPS, FedEx on the screen, but you also have situations where you have delivery drivers for Amazon. You also have DoorDash, and you have so many different situations, especially within COVID-19. Now that there's so much online purchasing and so many, delivery where, we're all stuck in our home because of COVID. So there's a lot of things you get delivered to your house. Well, what I wanted to look at is I wanted to be able to track my drivers in real time if I was one of these companies to understand where my drivers are located. I also wanted to provide functional use of the app for the driver. So how can the driver actually use the app, to benefit themselves in their day-to-day activity? And then also when we're making a delivery, as in any transportation management system, you want to give insight to your actual customers who are receiving these deliveries. So let's jump right into the demo. So say I am a driver for a transportation management company or a delivery company. I'm actually going to show this demo from the application itself from a mobile device as if I was that driver. So let's go into that driver or into the application here. As you can see, it's starting to render my location and it shows my location on the map. So what I have here is I have options to actually change the view of my map by clicking a drop down here where I can select road, I can select aerial, and if you can see here, if I select aerial, it will change my view. I have the ability to be able to drill in and out, where I can drill all the way down and actually see my neighborhood location. So from here we have a couple of options. One of the options is to plug in a destination and show some sort of a driving or a walking route, which I can click the destination and I can actually type it in. Now, what I have here is I have the ability to be able to type in an actual address with a street name, a street number, city, zip code, state, etc. I also have the ability, like any other map, to search for points on a map. So there's an actual popular state park in Pittsburgh called Point State Park, and it's where all three rivers in Pennsylvania, or in Pittsburgh, city of Pittsburgh, meet. So let's type that in. So we gave it a second to render. As you can see here, you can see all three rivers, and you can see that it's close to that point of right at Point State Park. So if I zoom in, you can actually see it close as well. Now, if I wanted to see a route to show my travel time, if I wanted to travel from my current location all the way to Point State Park, as well as the distance that I need to travel, and I wanted to choose driving, so I'll click on my cars here, which is a symbol for my driving. If I wanted to show walking, then I could click on the user icon there, or person icon. So here we'll click show route. As you can see, that changed the screen, and now I can actually show waypoints on my map where I can show my start and my end, and then it now gives me information about my travel. So it gives me the distance that I would have to travel there by car, and it also shows me the travel time in minutes. So in order to activate the Power Automate portion of this to send a text message to a recipient if I was making a delivery, I actually have this programmed to send a text message when I'm less than 30 minutes, or if I'm about 30 minutes away. So I'm a little over 30, so it's not going to trigger that right now. So I'm going to actually go back and I'm going to enter a new destination, and I'll choose a point that's a little closer that will allow me to be within or under 30 minutes, so we can see if that will trigger my Power Automate in order to send the automated text message to say my delivery is within 30 minutes. So from here, we'll click enter new destination. There's another state park that's pretty close. I don't know if it's a state park, but it's a pretty popular park in Pittsburgh. So it's called Shenley. So we'll type in Shenley Park. As you can see, it's already rendering that location. You can zoom in and out as we mentioned earlier. Now we'll click on show route, and now you can see it's a little closer. It's right before downtown Pittsburgh, and now at this point we have the opportunity to see if Power Apps will trigger my text message that says I'm within 30 minutes of making my delivery, because now my travel time has changed to 22.4 minutes. So we'll give that a few minutes. Sometimes it takes a few seconds for it to generate and come through. While we're waiting on that, actually there it is. So you can see here that I just got my text message that pops up on the screen. It says your delivery will arrive within 30 minutes. So my Power automated task did work. So if I were the recipient to receive this package or this delivery, excuse me, then I would have got my message saying that I'm within 30 minutes. Now I can change that Power Automate to do whatever I needed it to do, or I could change the time frame, the time factors. I can make all kind of different changes there, which we'll actually go into when we show the Power Automate demo portion of this. Now, one other thing to note is this actually came from an email address that I created to do this. Now, we'll talk about this later in the Power Automate portion of this demo, but you can use other apps that can send text messages. But I chose for demo purposes to use a free version of trying to send a text message. And so I used a Verizon number that I can just send an email to, which then generates the text message. So that's why it looks like it came from an email address and not an actual phone number. So stepping back over to the app here, one of the last thing that I would like to show from this perspective, before getting back into the presentation of the slides, is how we call Cognitive Services API to do a Bing entity search here. So as you can see, I have two buttons at the bottom of my screen here, and I also had these two buttons as well on the previous screen. So say I am that driver, and in this type of a situation, I was actually hungry, or it's around lunchtime, and I wanted to find restaurants that are near me. I have the ability to click a button to do a search to show restaurants that are near my current location. Say I have a pretty long drive, or in this case 23 minutes. Maybe I want to get something closer to my destination after I drop my delivery off, because I have a time frame that I'm trying to make that delivery within. So I also have a second button at the very bottom that shows me that I can find restaurants near my destination. So let's go ahead and try that out now. So as you can see, I'm in the east suburbs of Pittsburgh. I'm in a city called Monroeville. So when I clicked on restaurants near me, I actually got restaurants that are close to my actual location. If I go back and now I wanted to say maybe I'm not interested in eating anywhere near the location I'm currently at, or maybe I just want to see what restaurants are close to the destination that I'm traveling, I can hit restaurants near destination. Again, it will take me to that same screen, but you can see my list of restaurants changed, as well as I'm closer to downtown Pittsburgh. So now my city and my addresses have changed because I'm in a different location. So that's how Cognitive Services in Bing Entity Search was, it could be useful for a driver in a transportation management system, or in from a delivery company standpoint, to be able to have a functional use case of this app themselves as well, while also providing insight to the customers on how close the delivery actually is from being delivered. So let's head on back over to the slides and continue on our presentation. So you might think, is this a replacement for Google Maps? It is not a replacement for Google Maps. What I've showed was a static map in a Power Apps canvas, which essentially uses location services, and it can update in near real time, but it is not a turn-by-turn Google Map type of an application, whereas that's typically like an SDK that's embedded. Now, I have seen in recent news where Power Apps can interface with SDKs, but I've yet to try that functionality. But stay tuned, because I'll probably be looking to expand on this app and maybe have future presentations or blogs or vlogs about that SDK embedded into a Power App. Looking into the future. So I've come from more of a development background from a database standpoint and an administrative database background. Very rarely have I got into really application code unless I'm programming some sort of an ETL functionality, but maybe some of you have come from an application development background, but typically these are on two different wavelengths. This is where Power Apps really bridges the gap from a development effort. It's an easy to use expression language, and it's so powerful to interact with backend database and also give you front-end end user experience as well from a development effort. So even if you're not an app developer, you do have, the skill set to be able to adopt and interface with a backend database and provide a very functional app at the same time. Then we've also showed how we can incorporate AI into this as well. So we showed Cognitive Services. So really, Power Apps is extremely powerful for integrating multiple scenarios and multiple connectors and multiple data points and services. Let's very briefly talk about some pros and cons. Any solution and any tool you use, you always want to look at the upside and the downsides. I won't read this slide, but it's here for a reference. Here's some various things that I really like about Power Apps. A lot of them are overlap. various data connectors. It has an extremely easy interface that you can build expression languages and actually do some really cool coding functionality, and then integration with other tools, mobile and desktop design, low cost license fee as we showed earlier. Then some cons: the design's not interchangeable. On one of the pro sides, you can develop in a mobile or tablet or desktop style design, but you can't interchange the two. So once you start developing in a Canvas app one way, you can actually change it into a tablet design later if you started with a mobile design. Maybe that logic will change, maybe that design functionality will change, but I haven't seen anything on that. I'll look forward to that in the future if possible. The logic can get complicated when there's multi-layers, so I showed you an app that had 3 different screens. Well, once we dive into some of the code, and I also have reference slides as well that really break down the code, because we're not going to be able to show every single piece of code that was developed, but there's a lot of small nuances to consider when passing values between screens, etc. So that's just one thing to keep in mind when you're actually building these Power Apps. And it does require a work email, so it does require you to have some sort of an organizational or school email in order to utilize Power Apps. Also, as I mentioned and I've shown, and I'll kind of explain this a little bit more here, is when you go to your app store, whether if you're on an iOS device or an Android device, you have to download the actual Power Apps app. From within Power Apps, you sign in, and then you get all of your organizational apps in that, so you can actually deploy each individual Power Apps app to the store to download individually or on their own. And you can only develop one app at a time. So when you're you can have 2 apps active, but if you have different license structure, like the per user, you can only have a limited amount of apps running. So let's dive into another demo. Let's actually break down from the Power App Studio and design logic how we've built some of this functionality. So one of the things before we get started and we actually dive into the Power App Studio, we have to understand that in order to use Maps, you have to have some sort of an API key. So I'm using Bing Maps here, so I'm going to be using a Bing Maps key. You can also use Google keys, Google Maps as well, which you'll need a Google key. But before you do that, you actually have to sign up, and you have to actually create a key that you'll implement into your Power Apps design. Another thing to consider is our app is using location services. So in order to utilize this, you have to allow Power Apps to use location services on your computer as well. So essentially how you do that is you go into the settings and privacy and security settings, and you can see here that I've allowed Power Apps, and I allow it to ask before it actually utilizes my location services. So those are 2 important things to consider and keep in mind when you're developing an app that uses location services and maps. So when I log into Power Apps, you can see I'm in Power Apps. Here's my app here. I could also, click on flows, and I can create chatbots and AI builders and different things from this interface. But really what we want to look at is we want to look at our actual application. So once I click on apps here on the left hand side, I will then click on this ellipsis, and I'll click on edit. So this will actually open up my Power App Studio where I've designed my Power App. We'll cover this very briefly because there's a lot of logic here and there's a lot of information, and I have code reference slides, as I mentioned, for you to reference the code. So you can see here, as I said in my settings, I always have it to prompt me to use location services, so that's why this pop-up block came up. So we'll allow, you can see that then it rendered my map. So when you let's break down the map first, but before we get into that, actually I want to talk about one of the cons. Was if you have multi-layered apps, multi-layered development in your Power App, it can get pretty complicated. So one of the things that I like to hammer home is in your screens on your tree view over here, and I have several screens. I've showed 3. These are other screens that I look to expand on later, but we'll focus on these 3 screens. In the main screen, when you drop down, every single item on this screen is tied to something over here in the tree view. If you don't have proper naming conventions, it will be very difficult to realize and to understand the flow and what's controlling what. So one of the things that I highly recommend is you name things accordingly. So everything over here, I always use a text, or if it's a timer, I always prefix it with timer. If it's an icon, I prefix it with icon. You can use your own, labeling structure that you want, your own naming conventions, but that helps me to understand what item is actually on the canvas and what I'm modifying. So diving a little into the maps, you can see here that any actual item here has a series of actions and properties that are tied to it. So this is an image. This is an image icon, and so when you select image here, I can drop this down and I can select all kind of different things. If I click on that image or I select it, I can make it perform an action. Essentially what I'm doing here is I just want to reflect what's being displayed on my image. So when I click here and I see image, anything that is utilizing a static map, and it's a Bing map, so I have to call a specific URL and I have to pass in different functionality in here. So within here you can see that the last thing that I pass in is my Bing Maps key. So if you can see here, all of these different color codings that are listed are items that I have in my tree view or items on my canvas. And so from that standpoint, anything that I've developed that I've strung across this URL, I've had to build this URL based upon other things. So because my map changes when I click on certain buttons or type in certain locations or zoom in or drop down and show a different type of a view, all of that is programmed here by the different values that are set on different buttons and text input boxes. Another thing that I really wanted to show here is that my location services, in order to use location services, essentially I have a wrench here and an eraser. This is really just for me to troubleshoot different hidden things that I have. So this is more or less a function that I have that is more for troubleshooting. So if I actually click on Alt here, I can utilize this app here without actually playing the app or deploying it. So when I click here, you can see that I'm using, I have my coordinates here, and I also have a timer. I have some coordinates here as well. So these are things that just help me troubleshoot if something goes wrong, and then I can click here and remove it. So how this is using my location services is two different ways. Out of the box, you can actually just have text boxes or input box where you can just type in location.longitude. So this is the easy expression language that we talked about, or you can do over here location.latitude. Now, one of the things that I have here is I'm actually using a custom connector here because I'm doing something different with this custom connector. I'm stringing these along, but I noticed that these weren't as accurate as my custom connector. So I actually found another API that allows me to make a call out, and we'll talk about custom connectors a little bit later when we talk about cognitive services, but I just wanted to show the versatility of so many different ways that I could actually use my location services here. When I click on my car, I am setting different colors. So this is when I was showing in a functional app, if I wanted to show driving directions before I clicked on show route, that when I clicked on this on select, it is going to set my driving color to green, and it's going to set my walking color, which is just this icon of a user or a person here, to gray, which just indicates what's active for me. And then I'm also setting my transportation mode, which is another variable, to driving. Now this is what I actually carry over to my next screen, so I have to set it as a variable so I know when I build my directional map in my next screen what I'm carrying over. So again, that goes into all of the different variables and carrying locations or carrying different values across various screens. So it's important to have the proper naming convention. One last thing that I'll show here before I get into the database interaction of this is if I go into view and I go into my variables, this list on my main screen, in my global variables, every different variable that I'm using. So here again is my transportation mode, which is supplied by determining what I click on, and that's determining what value gets passed to my next screen, which is applied to my next map. So in this is extremely useful for knowing just at a high level high level circumstance what you're actually using here. So now I really want to show how to get into the actual database and how I've configured this to write to a database. So not only is this functional from an end user standpoint of the driver, not only is it useful for the actual recipient of the shipment or package that's being delivered to, but the actual TMS company or transportation management company, this could be useful for a manager or a dispatch service in order for them to be able to track all of their drivers. So every 20 seconds, I have a timer here that counts down from 20 seconds. Every 20 seconds, or actually this is 10 seconds, sorry, this will actually write the location coordinates and what input location that this driver has plugged in. So this will allow me to be able to create a report against that data set or that data table to show me where my drivers are. So maybe I'll have, if I have many drivers, maybe I have a specific ID tied to a driver. So when that driver is utilizing this app and they're tied to an account that's using this Power app, maybe I have that so I know where this driver is at all times. So diving into that, as I mentioned, on every item here, when you click on it, you have the ability to set different values that are tied to that specific item. So on here, on timer end, get to it, here is my expression language. I'm using a patch command and I have a connection to a database, and the database table is location services. And so essentially I'm plugging in and I'm doing an insert, which is what my patch is doing, and I'm plugging in the values for my text input location, which is here, and I'm also plugging in my latitude and my longitude location, and then I'm also plugging in a date timestamp of when this was written to the actual table. So again, very easy to bridge the gap between the application development and the interface of the backend database. To show this from a database perspective, I will call up Azure Data Studio and actually query this so you can see, as we were using the app, how it was writing records back to that database. So as we can see here, I pulled up Azure Data Studio. I have a transportation and logistics database, and within that database, and this is an Azure SQL database, and here's my location services. If I click run from my location services, you can see that I'm inputting my location, my latitude and longitude locations, when it was logged, and before I actually typed in anything in the input, it just came across as blank. You can see here that Point State Park is here, and this is where we actually typed in Point State Park. If I scroll down, you'll actually see where we typed in Shinley Park. So you can see here that we typed in Shinley Park, and that's where we were trying to find a location that was a little closer to where we could actually trigger our Power Automate to send the text message to the recipient to say we were within 30 minutes of making that delivery. So you can see how easy that was to integrate the connection to the backend database, and this is extremely useful for a dispatch center or a manager or someone at the company to be able to track drivers. And we could we could plot this on a map in Power BI, for example, or we can run some sort of a report that shows the difference between when drivers are making stops at various locations. There's all kind of things you can do with this, and obviously you can expand on this and create other logic and functionality that interfaces with your app and your database. So now let's head over back to the presentation. So as I mentioned in the demo portion of this, there's no way I could go over every piece of code that's within the demo. So I have a couple of slides here that are recaps of the code and the layout of the code. So if you were ever interested in building something like this, hopefully this is useful for you. So this just shows my static map, and it just gives a screenshot of the example I showed, and then it also shows what that expression language is on that map image. Here's another one that was on my second screen that actually showed the directions, and it actually showed, this is where I was able to show the time difference, or not the time difference, but I was actually able to show the travel time as well as how many miles away that my location was. And here's the URL that we constructed to create that as well. Essentially, the difference between this map and the previous map is that this map requires waypoints, which are the different start and end locations. You could also have stops in between as well, but hopefully this is useful. And then here's some of the different parameters and variables and the different things that we set on certain buttons and different text input boxes, etc. So this really is just a deep dive into the code and the expressions that we created here. So let's talk a little bit about Power Automate. So we showed how in a Power Automate situation we were able, or using Power Automate in Power Apps, how we were able to send the text message, and we were able to trigger that just based upon the travel time. And when the travel time hit a certain threshold, then it was able to trigger a Power Automate automation script to send the text message. So Power Automate, obviously, as we mentioned, is it's a workflow automation tool. So you could trigger it as we triggered it, automated from a Power App or from other situations or events. You could also trigger it from a click of a button. So I could have had a functionality on my Power App to click a button that said send email, but I wanted to take any kind of distractions potentially out of a driver to know exactly how far they are away to click a button and say send an email. I wanted to automate that. We could also run Power Automate flows on a scheduled time base as well. Another brief slide to just show the difference between the different plans. So really the biggest thing to take away from this is if you want to implement unlimited flows, so it's a per flow plan that's not per user per month. That's really the biggest difference here. So it really determines how you would want to structure this across your organization. When you get into Power Automate. Power Automate has a ton of templates. So there's a lot of things that you can just do straight out of the box. You may be able to find this useful for other different types of logic. What I created was a very, very simple Power Automate, and I simply just had two tasks. One was the Power Automate and one was a Gmail, because as you've seen, I was able to send a text message from a mail application. So we'll dive into that. So you can see here I've loaded up my Power Automate and I've logged in, and essentially it gives me some various templates. It gives me popular services. To your heart's content, play with these various templates. Here's different email templates, notification templates, etc. What I've done is I'll just go into my flows and I'll show you my flow. You can see here that it's just a Power App. It's a send mail. So if we go into that, we'll click edit here, and you can just see that this is triggered from a Power App, and we'll actually dive into that here shortly of how this is being called. And it's just calling a send email. So from the send email, I'm using a phone number on a Verizon wireless plan, and so many people are probably aware that you can send an email to a Verizon phone. Well, I should say you can type in the number of the phone number and then at VZW. I think it's vzw.com or vzw text or something similar. I don't want to dive in here because then it would expose the phone number here, but essentially I do have that as a screenshot in my code design and recap. So you will be able to see, how I've drilled into that and how you would configure something like this. But it's extremely simple. I could have used an app such as like Twilio or something like that that charges you per text message, but I wanted to find a way for demo purposes to show this and to be able to just send a text message free. I'm not using it as a production application. A production application, you would probably want to utilize something that is a paid service that will send an actual text message. So let's dive back over into the actual Power App to show how Power Apps actually calls this Power Automate. So So I'm still on my edit screen. Now, because this does this for my second screen, which is my route map screen, we'll go directly into that screen. Let me collapse and close some of this information. You will see some red X's here just because the travel time and the distance rely on you to have a start and end location. Because I went directly to this screen, even though it's not, you can't actually hit this screen from the Power App. You have to hit it from the main screen first. So in order to get to this screen, you have to have a location, destination, and you have to enter, show route. But that's why this is showing red. There's really not an error with the app. It's just that there's no value to be displayed here because there's no destination. But really what I wanted to show is how Power Automate works in this situation. So as you can see here, and this is another reason why I have this functionality. From the Power Apps, you can only see this when it's in real live time. But for troubleshooting effort and for configuration purposes, I have text boxes and timers and different things here that indicate what's actually happening at various points in the Power App functionality. So this is my notification. So this is essentially just populating a true, false, or a bit flag that says that if I've sent the notification or not, and it's based on if I've actually called my Power App button to send that text message. So I have a timer here, and this is my timer travel distance. I also have this timer here, which is a log location. So again, this is just me propagating from my first screen how to carry over the time logistics, so I can continue even on this screen to write to that database, every 10 seconds, when my drive, to notify where my, not notify, but to know where my driver is. So this timer though is where we're actually calling the Power Automate functionality. So if we go in here and we go on timer end, you can see here that I have I'm just doing a if else function. And I'm essentially wrapping my text input travel time text, which is this box here that gets populated to show me how far away my destination is. If it's less than 30 and my notification is false, that I haven't sent the notification, this is very important for a real-time type of a situation to not send repeated text messages, because obviously once I'm within 30 minutes, that's a large time frame. I don't want to send every time this timer ends. I don't want to say send a new text message, because it'll send text messages over and over within that 30-minute time interval. So once it sends it once, I want to reset this value to say that it's already sent, so my if else statement will return false even though I'm still less than 30 minutes out. But then I'm essentially saying if these two things are true, then essentially call my Power Apps button and then set my notification to true. So essentially from that standpoint, that will trigger my Power Automate. So this is the automated portion of calling Power Automate based on values that exist in the Power Apps. So we'll head on back onto the presentation. So just like Power Apps, we want to also look at some pros and cons of Power Automate. Hopefully this is just informative for maybe understanding and answering maybe some questions you have on what limitations it might have, etc. So as we've seen, we were able to interface with Power Apps. So it showed essentially easy interface with other apps. We were also able to simplify and automate tasks. So we were able to create an automated functionality based on a value in Power Apps to send a text message to our end user or to our recipient of a package in this case. And it's easy design interfaces. You can see in order to do something like that, I only had 2 workflow items on my canvas. So from a flow perspective, it's just drag and drop, and it's easy to configure various things within that design surface. It is user based, so not sure if that's really a con, but it's the same as Power Apps. It does require a user to have a work account or an organizational account to be able to log in to create Power Apps or Power Automate flows. And then you can only one user can modify the same flow at a time. So if I'm in that flow that I showed and I'm making modifications, another user can't log in even if I've shared that and make the same modifications at the same time. Actually, that may be a good thing because you don't want to overwrite someone else's, changes, or something else someone else is doing. And then last but not least, you cannot share outside of the organization. So usually this is organization based. It is part of the Power Platform, which is tied to, organization. So not sure if that's really a con either, but just things to really keep in mind when you want to utilize this as some sort of a automated process. So, as I showed, I didn't dive deep down into the logic of the Power Automate in the demo. However, I am showing it here because I'm able to mask certain information, and I didn't want to expose a phone number here. So really, hopefully this is just very useful for you if you wanted to create something similar for test purposes. As I mentioned, I just wanted to find an easy way to send a text message for free. However, if you were to implement something like this in a real application or a real-time use business application, then you may want to utilize other services that interface with Power Automate to send that. So very self-explanatory here. Here's the various code that I've used to create. As you can see, this Power Apps flow call is a little different than what I showed. This was just more of like a between statement when I was testing some different values, and I ended up settling on anything less than. So essentially this may look a little different than what you've seen in the demo, but hopefully you get the gist from a development standpoint. So last but not least, the icing on the cake. Cognitive services. So what is cognitive services? Cognitive services is essentially a set of APIs and SDKs and a service that allow you to apply artificial intelligence from an application standpoint. So essentially you need to have an API key tied to a specific service of cognitive services that you want to use. In our example, we use Bing Entity Search, so we were able to utilize a API that would call that entity. So essentially you don't need any real data science skills to implement this. It uses out of the box algorithms, underneath the hood to apply. And essentially you have a ton of different services to choose from. As we said, we did an entity search, which is the web search here, which is the fourth bullet point, but there's all these other situations that you can use cognitive services for. So with cognitive services in Power Apps, it does require a custom connector for what we used for Bing Entity Search. There is an out-of-the-box connector for cognitive services. I think it uses the Vision API, but I haven't used that out-of-the-box connector. I will dive in the demo portion of this, how to create that custom connector and how that's developed. Essentially, it's a REST API call, and then essentially it parses out the JSON response from that REST API call, and then from within the Power App you can then call the different JSON constructs in order to return the values from that JSON output. Here's just a very high level slide similar to Power Apps, similar to Power Automate, that really shows a breakdown of the cost, so you can understand how you would apply this and what type of cost breakdown you may get from using this inside of an application or using this within your organization. So with that, let's dive into our last demo. So we go into our Azure portal here to be able to look at our cognitive services. I essentially went to the marketplace and configured my my cognitive services, and then that takes you to a quick start. I was able to establish my keys, and so from my keys perspective, if I go into my keys and endpoints, this is the API key and the endpoint that was generated for me, and this is what we will use in the custom app development. Or not app, but the custom connector that we need to create. So diving back over into Power Automate, or I'm sorry, Power Apps, I can go into expand data and I can go into custom connectors, and I have a few custom connectors, but we're really only going to focus on our Bing Entity Search. So if I click on my little pencil to edit this will show you how this is configured. So essentially, again, here's where I'm calling the host of my endpoint, and we're doing a Bing Entity Search. So here's where I plug in my base URL, and I'll actually show you where I got this information from, because just from this cognitive services window, it may not be intuitive of how we've actually used this, but I'll actually show that here shortly. But back over here, when I go into my security, I have my API key. So this is where I'm calling my API key. And you have certain queries and you have parameters and headers that go into making a call to a Bing entity search, which will show. So once I go into my definition, I then have to create an action. So my action is what I'm actually going to retrieve or what I'm going to do with my Bing entity search. So essentially I have to pass in various parameters. So I have to pass in my header information and my search location information. And then from here, I also have to return my JSON. So from my JSON response standpoint, if I go into my response, these are all of the things that I get back from my JSON response. So again, here's where, if you remember the Power App screen, and we'll actually dive into that to show how we retrieve the JSON constructs and values. If you remember, I was able to show the URL, I was able to show the actual name of the restaurant, I was able to show the address and location, I was actually able to show the telephone number essentially. So this is what comes back from this, and how I was able to determine what comes back from this JSON is I took an example output of JSON and I plugged it into my sample, and then it parsed all of this out to know that this would be my return from that. So I was able to then create that, test it, and I'll speak about these parameters here and how we're actually using this. So when we get into Bing entity search, you can go into an API and you can click try now. When you click try now, that goes into an example. So you have to sign up essentially for it in Cognitive Services and the portal, and then you can actually generate your JSON, which is what I've copied out into my definition. When I says import from sample, that was my return body of my JSON, the results, and that was able to then parse out what I needed from my response. So the parameters of how I know what I need from a parameter standpoint is going back into this. Here's my JSON response. But if I go back into Cognitive Services in a quick start allows me to look at the different APIs that in services and endpoints that I could use. So if I go into an entity search here, that will just show me how I would implement this. So for the sake of time, I won't break all of this down, but when you go in the next step, you can try an interactive demo. You can do a quick start, the Bing Entity Search API reference section. So when you click here, this is how I knew what to actually plug in to my custom app when I was developing my custom app here. So if we go back, my Bing version 7.0 and the host name that I need to plug in for my endpoint. So when I was in here, that allowed me to know what I needed to plug in. And then here is where it talks about the header information and the query information that you actually have to supply. So here's the subscription key. So this is the API key that you need to plug in. So when we go back again to the definition, you can see that this is my subscription key, and in my location, you have to know if you're doing an entity search where your location, this is where I'm supplying from my Power App my location coordinates, so my latitude and longitude locations. From here, the query in a market is just telling me that I'm actually passing in my query the market, which is US, and it's in English. So you can do different languages and different things like that. So essentially that's how I created the connector. Now how you utilize that connector is when you go into your screen here, and we'll just start from this screen. As you can see that I actually created a data source for Cognitive Services. So here you can see my Bing entity search. And I created a button, and as I mentioned, on every button or every item here on your canvas screen, you actually have to, you can specify what action you want to take place. So on select of that button, I'm setting a variable called place. which I'm going to be, this is how I'm carrying the values over to my next screen, and that's the screen that it goes to that actually shows the list of my restaurants. So I'm calling the name of my my data source or my connection, and then I'm doing a search, which is the action. If you remember coming back here, this was the action, was the search. And then my query is restaurants near me, so that's what I'm searching for. My market, which was also a part of that query, was English and it's in US. Here's my subscription. So again, I'm hard coding and passing in. I could have created this as parameter values as well, or I could have custom coded that. I actually have that defaulted within here as well. So if I go back into my security, I actually have that defaulted, so I technically wouldn't need to pass this in here, but just for sake of demo, I wanted to just show the full construct of how you would create this expression and show. So from here, I'm creating my subscription key. Here's my latitude and longitude location. So again, this is where I'm calling it from my text boxes or from values that are on my canvas. And then I'm just saying dot places dot value. So I'm setting all of my my entities that I'm searching for back to this set place. So then when I go, or set place is the variable, so when I go back into my entity search screen, what I have in my entity search screen is I have a gallery. Within my gallery, I actually have different labels that are tied to my gallery in different text boxes. So when you go into the gallery is a list of items. So as you can remember, I was scrolling through the list of items here. My list of items is the items that returned from my Bing entity search. And so this is where I get my list of items from the JSON result, and I've just passed it from the variable from the other screen called place as I was setting that. And then within that, every one of these values, I'm saying this item dot, and then this is where I'm getting my return from. So when we go back into the definition, all of the results here are what can be returned. So if we go back into the design again, I'm bringing back the address, the region, the postal code. I'm bringing back the restaurant name. I'm bringing back the URL, which I've encoded into a clickable link. So I've had to apply some HTML text here. Same thing with the actual web search URL. So this will take me to the actual web address of that restaurant, etc. So that's essentially how you would configure your custom data source, and you would be able to use that functionality, which calls the Cognitive Services API from within the Power Apps. So back over to the presentation to finish up. So as with Power Automate and Power Apps, we also want to talk about some pros and cons of the Cognitive Services tool as well. So it's a low learning curve. As I mentioned, you don't really have to be a data scientist to utilize it. It's using, you don't have to build any algorithms. It's using algorithms underneath the hood. You can quickly integrate it as we showed. It is part of Azure services, so you can not only use it with Power Apps, but you can use it with a ton of other services and applications as well within our Azure architecture, as well as anything third party and outside, because it's essentially calling an API key and an endpoint. There's constant updates and improvements from Microsoft, so they're always striving to make the services better. So that's always great to see enhancements. And then some limited or some cons about Power Apps is if you are a data scientist and you like to actually play with the backend code and you like to mix and match and change things about algorithms, it does not give you that functionality. But again, it's great for out of the box use, and as we mentioned, Microsoft is constantly updating and improving these services. Here's another code and design recap. So again, if you wanted to build something similar to this is just, again, a piece of code that really just showed how this was configured. Now I've hidden the actual API key, so that's why you get a little blank out, and I know I showed that in the actual presentation portion of the demo, but that was just used for test purposes anyway. So but again, if you wanted to integrate something like that, then you would replace your own key there. that you've created in your own, Azure subscription. So scaling and enhancements, this is just some additional things that we could potentially do. Add some error handling. We could integrate, other apps and other functionality. We could add some additional screens. So the sky's the limit for Power Apps and cognitive services and Power Automate. We could do some pretty fascinating things. I felt that this was pretty in depth from a demo standpoint. However, you could always go further. As I mentioned, there's potential of doing some turn by turn. If you've seen, I had another screen called turn by turn. That's just some future enhancements I'm actually working on. And then last here, I do have references to all of the URL links that I've showed here, and some additional ones that helped me kind of put this solution together, and also gave me some more information and some more insight onto how some of these connectors and so how some of these things are built. And so hopefully you can use this as a reference guide as well. Want to give a special thanks in closing to Microsoft for supporting that Data Platform Geeks and SQL Server Geeks and community initiatives. Special thank you to Data Platform Summit for allowing me to speak here today, and I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope this was very useful, and stick around for question and answers if need be. One last thing to just note here is there's some ways that you can win prizes here. So it's very helpful for us as speakers to get some feedback and constructive criticism. If there's things that I could do better, or if there's things you liked, definitely give session and conference feedback. Here, post a selfie yourself. Hopefully you might win a prize. And then obviously, from some different Twitter handles, follow the Data Geeks and Data AI Summit. Also, I have my Twitter handle as well in here. So if anyone has specific questions or wants to reach out to me on Twitter or LinkedIn, my Twitter handle and my LinkedIn URL are also within this presentation. So thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Data Platform Summit 2020.